They called it the Convocation of Titans, a gathering of the strongest, most advanced species in the known galaxy. A meeting where only the elite sat at the front, where the rulers of empires and the warriors of legend dictated the course of history. And yet, when humanity arrived, they chose the back. Not out of fear, not out of deference, but because they preferred to watch. To the rest of the galaxy, humans were an anomaly. Not the weakest, but certainly not the strongest. Not the most technologically advanced, but always a step ahead when it mattered. They built ships that moved like predators in the void, whispered to AI that other species barely understood, and fought wars in ways no one could predict. And still, they never sought to dominate. They never demanded a seat at the high table. Instead, they watched, calculated, waited. That silence unsettled the old powers. None more than General Exilvar of the Braxion Dominion, a species bred for war, their bodies towering over most sentience, their strength unmatched in combat. He had crushed fleets, burned planets, and earned his place at the very front of the convocation. Yet, as he sat among his peers, his gaze kept drifting to the humans, sitting quietly at the back, their expressions unreadable. He could not understand it. Every other race fought for recognition, yet these frail-looking creatures sat as if they already knew how this meeting would end. It grated at him. They had no right to such confidence. Finally, he spoke, his voice a deep rumble that silenced the chamber. "Humans, why do you sit in the back? Are you afraid?" The human ambassador, a man known only as Calloway, smiled in a way that made Exilvar uneasy. "Not afraid," he said, his tone light. "Just comfortable." A murmur spread through the assembly. The response was neither submission nor challenge, it was something else. Something unreadable. Exilvar sneered. "Comfortable? In the shadows?" Calloway tilted his head slightly, as if considering something amusing. "Funny thing about the back row, General. It's where you can see everything. Who speaks? Who listens? Who thinks they have control?" His eyes, sharp and knowing, flicked toward the grand display at the center of the chamber, the same one tracking every fleet movement, every shifting alliance. And who was about to make a mistake? Selvar scoffed, but something in the room had changed. The other species had noticed it too, that shift in the air, the realization that the humans weren't just observing. They were measuring. Before Exilvar could respond, a sudden alert flickered across the display. A warning! A fleet had moved one that should have been stationary. Gasps echoed as delegates scrambled to analyze the data. Only Calloway remained still, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, as if he had expected this. Selvar turned back to the humans, his certainty now fraying at the edges. "What did you do?" Calloway's smile never faltered. "We sat in the back," he said, "and we waited for you to ask the wrong question." Selvar felt his jaw tighten as the display flickered again, revealing a new series of fleet movements, subtle, nearly imperceptible, but undeniable. Somewhere, out in the vast void, something was happening. Something the humans had seen before anyone else. The other delegates leaned forward, their whispers growing frantic, their voices edged with uncertainty. How had humanity noticed what the greatest military minds of the galaxy had overlooked? Calloway remained calm, his fingers still tapping in an absent rhythm against the table. His eyes scanned the chamber, watching the reactions, measuring them just as he had been since the moment they arrived. It was no accident that humanity sat in the back. It was no sign of weakness. It was a vantage point, a tactical decision. And now, as confusion rippled through the assembly, it was becoming clear they had seen this coming. Selvar's patience was wearing thin. "Explain," he growled. "Now." Calloway exhaled slowly, as if deciding how much to say. Then, without looking at the display, he spoke. "Your borders," he said casually. "They've already been breached." A stunned silence fell over the chamber. A few delegates laughed nervously, dismissing the claim as human arrogance, but others turned to their aides, demanding real-time updates. Zelva's hand clenched into a fist. "Impossible," he spat. "The Braxian fleets. are moving to counter an attack that hasn't happened yet. He finally stood, his movements unhurried, his gaze locked onto Excelvar's. Which means whoever planned this has already won. The weight of his words sent a ripple of unease through the assembly. The convocation was meant to be the unbreakable stronghold of the galaxy's mightiest empires, the heart of interstellar strategy. If an enemy had infiltrated this deep without being noticed, it meant only one thing: someone on the inside had let them in. A betrayal. Selvar's eyes darted back to the display, scanning the shifting fleet patterns. Then he saw it. A single ship, barely large enough to register, slipping past the Braxian defensive lines. It was too small to be a warship, too lightly armed to be a real threat. And yet, it moved with intent, cutting through the void like a knife finding the seam in armor. It was already past his outermost defenses, headed directly for the convocation itself. Who gave the order to stand down our outer patrols? He barked, spinning toward his officers. They scrambled for answers, but the truth was written across their faces. They didn't know. The order had been given from inside the convocation. Calloway adjusted his cuffs, glancing at the display as if this were all inevitable. The problem with sitting at the front, he mused, is that you never see the dagger until it's already at your throat. The alarms sounded. A single proximity alert. Then another. Then a cascade. The unseen enemy had arrived. And humanity, the quiet observers in the back, were the only ones who had seen it coming. The alarms blared through the chamber, a shrill warning that sent the gathered warlords and politicians into a frenzy. Selvar was already issuing orders, his voice a steady anchor in the rising panic, but Calloway barely acknowledged him. The human ambassador stood motionless, eyes locked on the display, watching the impossible unfold. The enemy had already breached their defenses. Not through brute force, not through overwhelming numbers, but by simply walking through the door left open for them. And that meant only one thing: this wasn't just an invasion. It was a coup. Across the chamber, a dozen different species scrambled to react, but humanity did not. The delegation from Earth remained still, hands folded, eyes scanning the chaos with eerie calm. They had seen betrayals like this before, had lived through them time and time again. The difference now was that they were not the ones caught unaware. Calloway tapped his earpiece twice. A low confirmation tone clicked in response. That was all the signal he needed. Somewhere beyond the convocation's reach, hidden fleets were already moving. Humanity had learned long ago that power wasn't about the size of your armada or the number of worlds under your control. It was about knowing where the knife would strike before it was even drawn. A heavy-set alien with deep blue scales pushed forward, his voice sharp with accusation. You knew this was coming. The Xinkar representative's nostrils flared as he pointed a clawed finger at Calloway. You sat back and watched. Why didn't you warn us? Calloway tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Would you have believed me? The Xinkar faltered, mouth opening, then closing. That was the thing about the great powers of the galaxy. They believed in brute strength, in fleets, in firepower. Humanity had none of those advantages when they first stepped onto the interstellar stage, so they adapted. They became something else. They became the unseen variable in every equation, the quiet force that turned empires inside out before their enemies even realized the game had changed. A Braxian officer rushed to Excelvar's side, whispering hurriedly. The general's expression darkened. He turned back to Calloway. Tell me what you know. For the first time since the meeting began, the human ambassador's expression hardened. You're not gonna like it. Selvar growled. Tell me anyway. Calloway exhaled, then tapped a sequence into his wrist display. The convocation's main holoprojector flickered, the map shifting from fleet movements to something far older. A series of strange, intricate symbols appeared, spiraling outward into a complex pattern. The alien leaders stared, some in confusion, others in dawning horror. This isn't just an attack, Calloway said quietly. It's a reclamation. The chamber fell silent. Selvar's gaze narrowed. Of what? Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. of something buried beneath this very station. Something humanity has known about for a long, long time. The alarms shifted in pitch. The enemy was inside. The station trembled, the deep groan of stressed metal reverberating through the chamber as something massive made contact. Calloway barely flinched. The others did. The Xinkar representative took an uneasy step back, his frilled crest flaring with alarm. A Braxion officer barked into his communicator, demanding status reports, but the replies were chaotic, fragmented. The enemy was already inside. Selvar clenched his fists, his eyes burning with frustration. "What is buried here, human?" Calloway exhaled slowly, as if weighing how much to reveal. "A failsafe," he said at last. "From a time before any of you ever set foot in space." A fresh explosion shook the station. Calloway's earpiece crackled. "Command, this is Echo 2. Confirming breach enemy units in the lower sector. Resistance is holding, but we've got movement toward the core." Selvar growled. "You knew about this invasion. You prepared for it." Calloway finally turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "We didn't prepare for an invasion." His voice was steady, but the weight of his words pressed down on the room like a vice. "We prepared for what would happen if the wrong hands ever touched what's down there." Another explosion. Closer this time. The chamber security doors slammed shut, emergency lockdown procedures kicking in. The overhead lights flickered as someone tried to wrest control of the station's systems. Zelvar's officers were shouting now, scanning through incoming reports, their faces growing graver by the second. "General," one of them called out, "we're getting anomalies. Systems behaving erratically, unauthorized movements in automated defenses." He hesitated, swallowing hard. "Sir, I think the station is waking up." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The aliens didn't understand, not fully. But Calloway saw it in Exelva's eyes, the creeping realization that this wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a countdown. Calloway pressed a finger to his earpiece again. "Override the relays. If the core is compromised, you know what to do." Silence. Then, "Understood, sir." The weight of that confirmation settled in his chest like a lead weight. Selvar caught the shift in his expression. "What did you just order?" Calloway didn't answer immediately. He watched the display, watched the enemy movements, the relentless push toward the buried core of the station. "If they reach it," he said finally, "none of this matters. Not the war, not your fleets, not your empire." Zelvar's gaze hardened. "Then we stop them." A cold smile flickered across Calloway's face. "That," he said, "was always the plan." The chamber doors groaned, something on the other side forcing them apart. The light beyond was wrong, too sharp, too artificial, pulsing with an intelligence that should not exist. And then, for the first time, the station spoke. "Humanity, you should not have returned." The station's voice was not mechanical. It wasn't cold, like an AI. It was something else, something older, something that carried the weight of 1,000 forgotten wars. The chamber doors continued to grind open, the metal screeching as if protesting against the thing forcing its way through. Selvar's officers raised their weapons. Calloway didn't bother. He already knew bullets wouldn't matter. The light beyond the door pulsed again, shifting in color red, then white, then something his eyes couldn't quite process. Calloway's earpiece crackled to life. "Sir, we have a problem. The core, it's not just waking up. It's rejecting us." A cold knot formed in his stomach. The failsafe had been simple. If the enemy reached the station's buried secret, humanity would trigger the final protocol and erase everything before it could be used against them. But this wasn't the enemy breaking in. It was the station itself locking them out. A new voice, deeper, older than the first, rumbled through the chamber. "This is not your war to fight." For the first time since arriving, Exelvar looked truly uncertain. "Calloway," he muttered, "what is this?" Calloway barely heard him. His mind was racing, running through old reports, classified files buried so deep they weren't even supposed to exist anymore. The station wasn't just a vault. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a remnant, something left behind by those who came before. A harsh beep on his wrist display made his stomach sink further. Incoming contacts. Not enemy ships. Not friendly ones either. Unknown signatures. Deep space distortions. Then, a transmission. Human language. This is the pale hand to all surviving Terran forces. Your cycle is over. Stand down. Selvar turned, eyes narrowing. That's human. Calloway swallowed hard. Not exactly. The chamber doors finally gave way, and the light poured in, consuming everything. For a brief moment, Calloway caught a glimpse of something beyond the threshold, towering figures clad in ancient battle armor, their eyes burning with a light that was not entirely natural. The old war wasn't just repeating itself. It had never ended. Calloway's instincts screamed at him to move, but his body felt frozen. The figures emerging from the chamber weren't just remnants of some lost human faction. They were something else, something older, something forgotten. The Pale Hand. A name buried in the deepest layers of classified history, dismissed as myth, but now standing before him, undeniable and very, very real. The lead figure stepped forward, armor humming with an energy that Calloway's sensors couldn't place. "You were not meant to wake this place," it said, its voice carrying the weight of ages. "This war belongs to us." Zelvar raised a weapon, his mandibles clicking in unease. "Whatever you are not in command here." The figure barely acknowledged him. "You cling to scraps of an empire you do not understand, alien. But this is not your fight." The station shuddered. Outside, the incoming signatures grew clearer. They weren't just ships, they were massive constructs, built with technology so advanced that even the most cutting-edge human engineering paled in comparison. Humanity had always adapted, had always endured. But now, they faced something designed to ensure they never rose again. Calloway gritted his teeth. "If this isn't our fight, then whose is it?" The pale hand figure tilted its head slightly. "Yours, if you can survive it." In that moment, the station's systems went haywire. Alarms screamed. Gravity flickered. The star charts updated in real time, revealing a fleet unlike anything ever recorded. The enemy they had been fighting, the ones who had pushed humanity to the brink, had been running too. Running from this. Calloway slammed his comms. "All units, full retreat now." Selvar's warriors hesitated. "We just fought our way in," one of them hissed. "Now we run?" Calloway didn't have time for arguments. "You don't understand. You're not dealing with an empire, a species, or even a war machine. This is cleanup. And we're the mess." The first blast struck before he finished speaking. The enemy fleet, once terrifying in its own right, was being torn apart like paper. Weapons fired, but nothing hit their attacks, simply phased through the colossal new arrivals, as if the universe itself refused to acknowledge them. And then came the realization. Humanity had fought, bled, and clawed its way to survival for centuries. But they had never truly won. They had only been allowed to exist until now. Calloway's ship relayed its own sensor data, confirming what he already knew deep down. They weren't going to win this fight. The best they could do was escape. But then, through the chaos, a transmission cut through the madness. It wasn't from the enemy. It wasn't from the Pale Hand. It was human. A voice from deep space, from a source that should not exist. "Stand by. Reinforcements inbound." The impossible just became inevitable. The voice cut through the static like a blade, impossibly clear, impossibly human. Calloway barely had time to process what he'd just heard before his ship's systems lit up with proximity alerts. Something was arriving, something big. But not the enemy. Not them. A tear in space split open beyond the ruined battlefield, a fracture of swirling light and shifting matter. Then they emerged. Ships unlike anything Calloway had ever seen, yet undeniably human. Their hulls bore no fleet insignia, no known markings of the Terran Defense Force or any faction he recognized. but their signatures were unmistakable. Human. Ancient. The pale hand warrior beside him stiffened. Even they looked shaken. "This is not possible," the figure murmured. Calloway exhaled sharply. "Yeah, we tend to specialize in that." The newcomers wasted no time. Their weapons, if they could even be called that, fired pulses of energy that didn't just strike the enemy ships, but unraveled them, as if rewriting reality itself. The impossible fleet that had shattered the galaxy's strongest was now coming apart like mist under the morning sun. The surviving remnants of the human and Exovar forces wasted no time retreating. This was no longer their fight. Whatever force had arrived, whoever they were playing a game beyond the rest of them. Calloway's fleet pulled back to a safe distance, watching as the titanic conflict continued. The enemy never even had a chance. And then, as quickly as they had come, the new ships ceased fire. Their leader hailed Calloway directly, their voice rich with something both familiar and utterly foreign. "You were never meant to be left alone," they said. "But you have proven yourselves." A long silence followed. Calloway felt a dozen questions clawed his mind, but in the end, only one mattered. "Who are you?" The response came with quiet certainty. "The first humans. The ones who left before history was written." A pause. "And we are very, very proud." The comms cut. The fleet turned, their massive ships vanishing back into the rift as if they had never been there at all. The war was over. Days later, as humanity regrouped, Calloway stood aboard his bridge, staring out at the stars. The Exovar envoy beside him was still struggling to grasp what had happened. "You were losing," the alien muttered. "And then you were not." "What are you?" Calloway let a small smirk tug at the corner of his mouth. "Survivors." The galaxy had learned something that day. Humanity wasn't just a tenacious species clawing its way through the stars. They were something older, something forgotten, something unfinished. And now, as they stood at the edge of history's next great turning point, the ones who had once sat in the back were done waiting.